Hey everybody, welcome back to the next part in my Unlocking the Fretboard series. This is going to be part 4. There's been a big gap between when I did part 3 and now, but I've just been so busy with other things, but I've really been wanting to get back to this series. I had great response from it, and I think this is probably one of the most important series I have done as far as guitar playing goes. And I think the tricks that I'm laying out and the ideas I'm laying out in these videos are going to really help just about any guitar player who doesn't already know these things to really expand their playing and their knowledge on the fretboard, to improvise better, to write better music, to come up with better ideas, and the list goes on and on. So, just to recap, I have 3 parts in this series so far. Part number 1 was called Interval Shapes and Their Massive Importance. Part 2 was called Chord Chemistry, Developing the Ability to Build and Recognize Any Chord. And Part 3 was called Mastering Arpeggios Over the Entire Fretboard. So in Part 1 in the intervals, we looked at specific interval shapes and knowing how to find those on the guitar fretboard. You know, we all know the trusty old power chord. Well, that's actually just what we know as a perfect 5th interval, right? So if we can map out all the intervals, which are going to be the building blocks for all of our scales and chords, and be able to recognize those intervals just by shape instantaneously, it's really going to go a long way to us being able to navigate the fretboard in a very beneficial manner. In part 2 about chord chemistry, I took the information from part 1 and I expanded it to say now if we have the knowledge of how we can use these intervals to build chords, once we have the shapes on our fretboard and the knowledge of how to put them together, we can build and utilize any chord in existence just by seeing the name and knowing how to lay it down on our fretboard. And in part 3, we kind of took a closer look at major and minor arpeggios, but all over the fretboard, utilizing all 6 strings and then breaking them down into even smaller 3-string patterns for ease of memorization and utilization in a more musical manner. So I don't want to go through all of those things again. Please go back and watch the first 3 parts in this series. You're going to kind of need those to understand exactly what I'm talking about in this series. But today I want to take us a step further to really start making these ideas musical, especially the ideas from part number 3. So in part number 3, we talked about having sort of bigger 6-string arpeggios, maybe something like a major arpeggio. Overall 6 strings, right? And having those in different places. And covering our entire fretboard. But then we talked about breaking them down into smaller pieces. And wherever they may lay, so that no matter where we were, we could find a needed arpeggio at any place on the fretboard and almost instantaneously. Well, today we want to take those patterns and we want to expand them into all of our 7th arpeggios. You might say, what do I mean by 7th? Well, the 7th family of chords isn't really the right way to say it, but you'll know what I mean. What we can do is we can take a major chord, we can make it into a major 7th chord. We can take a minor chord, make it into a minor 7th. We can also expand that into dominant 7th chords, minor 7th flat 5 chords, okay? So those are going to be all extremely usable and musical chords when used in the right place. You might say, well, that sounds like a lot to remember. How am I going to be able to sort of absorb all this? Well, the beauty of it in talking about chord construction like I did in part 2, we already know how these chords are kind of spelled out, right? For instance, a major 7th is going to be the 1st, 3rd, 5th, and 7th. We're on our root note, we go to a 3rd interval. We add a 5th interval, we add a 7th interval. We play those together. We have a major 7th arpeggio, okay? If we want a minor 7th arpeggio, we spell it out the 1st, the flat 3rd interval, the 5th, and the flat 7th. We got our minor 7th arpeggio. If you want a dominant 7th arpeggio, we take our 1st, our 3rd, and our 5th, and we add a flat 7th to it. And if we want something like a minor 7th flat 5, we take the 1st, the flat 3rd, the flat 5, and the flat 7. Little bit of a different sounding arpeggio. Okay, well you might still say, okay, well that's fine and dandy, but how do we put this in a way where we could learn to utilize them with as little effort as possible? Well, going back again to knowing our interval shapes, right? When we first did the part 1 in this series, I talked about, like I mentioned, we have, you know, 5th intervals, 3rd intervals, 7th intervals, flat 7th, 6th, and so on and so forth. And we have those in various places spread out over different octaves, right? We could have a 3rd interval here. We could also have a 3rd interval here, and we could have a 3rd interval here as well, right? We can have a 7th interval here, but we could also have it here in various different places. So if we've memorized those, and through the work to memorize those, we probably recognize a few things. We want to think of our 7th intervals, which are going to be very important in building, obviously, our 7th chords, as having a relationship to the root note, or the number 1. And if you notice in the little download packages I made available on my website, and there's going to be one available for this as well, and I'll have the link in the description below. But in those packages, in all of the fretboard diagrams for our arpeggios and our intervals, I always marked off where the root note was. And the reason is I think it's a very important thing to know. If I'm playing a little A major arpeggio, let's say, I know from my knowledge of studying this that that's my root note. And I also have another, you know, root note up there, or a number 1 interval, we'll call it, which also exists right here. So knowing how that lays out all over the fretboard is very important, because here is a very important thing to know. When we have our root note, 1 fret back, or 1 fret lower from that, will always be our 7th interval, or our major 7th interval. So if I know that I'm playing an A major arpeggio, I know that 1 fret behind is going to be my 7th interval. So if I know that, how hard is it for me to be able to take my 1, 3, and 5, and my other 1 here, and just instantly know, without even any new knowledge, other than knowing that our 7th interval is 1 fret behind, how hard is it going to be to just add that in? So now I take my little shape here, knowing this is 1, I'll start 1 fret behind. And I also know there's a 1 up here, so 1 fret behind that would also be another 7th interval. So to turn my existing shape that we already know and learned in one of our previous parts into a major 7th arpeggio is simple. You might say, well, what good is that? Well, now we're starting to get more musicality built right into our arpeggios. So we can start navigating and throwing in more colorful tones, whether we're using this as an arpeggio, or whether we're playing it as a chord and we just want to say, okay, where's that 7th interval, right? I can start creating different chord shapes. But just that knowledge of where's my root note, I automatically know where my 7th interval is going to be. So then we say, well, what about a minor? Okay, well, here's an A minor arpeggio. So again, here's our 1, here's our flat 3, here's our 5, here's our 1 again. Well, we know to make that a minor 7th arpeggio, what we need to do is add a flat 7th to it. Well, if a 7th is going to be 1 fret behind our root note, then a flat 7 or a minor 7th interval is going to be 2 frets behind it. We have our A minor arpeggio. I can start 2 frets below it. There's my flat 7th or minor 7th. And here was my other number 1 or root note, and I can go 2 frets behind that is going to be a flat 7th or minor 7th interval as well. Now I have a little minor 7th arpeggio. You look at that and you say, oh, I kind of almost see like a little pentatonic shape going on. That's exactly what it is, just with the D note or the 4th interval left out. What a way to make our pentatonics even more musical, thinking more in terms of arpeggios, right? So this is a minor 7th arpeggio. If I'm playing over this A minor, Instead of just playing straight up the minor pentatonic, to be very predictable. Right? It gives us a different approach once we're very comfortable with it. So again, I have a major 7th arpeggio, minor 7th arpeggio. Now I don't want this video to be 2 hours long, so I'm not going to go through every shape. If you've watched the previous videos about the interval shapes, how to construct the chords, and then mainly the part 3 where I showed you all of these different arpeggio shapes, we can take those and we can just alter them ourselves with this new knowledge, right? So we say, well, how else can this work? Well, knowing that we have a flat 7th, which is always going to be 2 frets behind our root note, and a normal 7th or a major 7th, 1 fret behind, we could create all of our other 7th arpeggios very easy with the knowledge we already have and nothing more than that. Now, it might take a little bit of practice to get comfortable utilizing them, get them under our fingers so we're not having to think about it as much, and that's perfectly fine. That takes time to really get the muscle memory going, but the knowledge part of it is simple with what we learned in the first 3 parts of this series. So I really do think this is so incredibly important. So let's take something like a dominant 7th. Well, we know that that is spelled out 1st interval, 3rd interval, 5th interval, and a flat 7th, or a minor 7th, right? So 1, 3, 5, flat 7. So again, I could start off with my major arpeggio. Instead of adding the 7th, I'm going to take the major, the 1, 3, and the 5, but I'm going to add the flat 7th to it. So 2 frets back from my root note, which would be here and here. You see how we can already come up with some interesting ideas. Right? Just knowing where that is. And we can move these around to different places as well, right? If I know that I also have a major arpeggio up here, and I know that this here is my root note or my number 1 interval, just gives us different shapes under our fingers. I could also say, I know that's there, but that note also exists up here. So I could also have something like this. And again, that's just from taking this pattern, which was from one of our previous lessons, and knowing I can add the flat 7th to it to make it dominant. And once we get comfortable with that, we can start moving that around, coming up with very musical ideas. We could move those anywhere. And again, I don't want to just give you example after example, but I do have on my website right now, and I'll have the link below, a link to the download package, which gives you all of these patterns so you could have them in PDF format just to be able to practice them without having to think about them, but also really think through those relationships so that you do understand why things are what they are. And let's go one more example, a minor 7th flat 5. You might go, whoa, now what's going on? Well, we know from our previous lesson on chord chemistry that that would be spelled out 1, flat 3, flat 5, flat 7, right? So we would take our minor arpeggio, knowing that this was my 1 or my root note, this is the flat 3, and this is the 5. Well, I need to make the 5 flat, and I need to add a flat 7, which we know is going to be 2 frets behind my root note. So here's my 1, flat 3, flat 5. I add my flat 7. Right, some different sounds out of that. But again, it's just all about learning the reason why it is like that, getting the pattern under your fingers, and then deciding musically where you want to use it. And that's going to be a topic for a future video when we talk about how some of these things work together. And this can be used for any of the patterns that we learned in part 3, okay? It doesn't matter where we are. If I was down here on my 6th string, and I wanted to do an A major arpeggio, and I know this is my root note and this is my root note, and I want to do a major 7th arpeggio, I just go a fret back from my root note. Doesn't matter where we are. Okay, any of the patterns are going to work, right? That's my number 1. Could also choose to move that up to the same place in the next string for ease of fingering. There's a dominant 7th, right? So what happens is we start to get very comfortable, they get on our fingers, and we're going to already know what the sound of them are before we even play them. And that's when we know we start to have these under our fingers really well. What do you guys think? Is that clear? I hope I didn't kind of ramble on too much about it. So again, this lesson here is probably not going to make a whole lot of sense unless we've looked at the first 3 parts of this series. So I'm going to have the link to those below. I'm going to have the link to the download packages to go along with this up on my website. So I'm going to have more coming up in this series soon. I hope that was enjoyable, and I hope that helps a few folks. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. Please like the video. Please share it with anybody who you think would get use out of it, and help spread the word about this little series, because I really do think it can be beneficial to a lot of guitar players who haven't looked at things in this manner. And of course, there's a lot of folks who have, and then it's probably not going to be much use to them, but that's all right too. Please subscribe to the channel. Hit the little bell notification to get notified when I put new content out, and I will be back really soon with some more content. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. Ciao for now.